Namaste, Dhanava Pranam. I'm here with cardiologist Dr. Sundeep Mishra. He has been a friend of the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute and Sri Chaitanya Saraswati Institute for many years and has participated and given much valuable contribution to many of the science and scientist conferences, as well as other very nice interactions with Srila Bhakti Niskam Shanta Maharaj. And we feel very blessed that he is here today with us to discuss the logic of life, first chapter of Idols of the Mind versus True Reality by Dr. Bhakti Madhava Puri. Dr. Mishra, thank you.
Namaste, everybody.
So, Dr. Mishra, would you like to share just any thoughts that you had from that Logic of Life video before we get into more of the discussion, or should we get into the discussion first?
I think, the brief thing I liked about the video was the concept that, it's with machines. And I think nowadays there's a lot of focus on artificial intelligence as well. And people are sort of thinking about artificial intelligence. And the way it seems is that, couple of things, I think, about the mechanical systems or purely chemical systems is that, they conform to, one direction movement. So, the environment acts upon them and they do something. And then, like they don't kind of have their own free will, so to say. And they don't have that choice where they can choose what to do. So for the example, like you throw the ball up and you are sure it will come down. So there is only one option for the ball once you throw it up. But for the bird, the options are many. So it might fly even more. It might come down, or it might just go horizontal. So I think that sort of thing is, I think, talking about choice, which the living systems do have in one way or other. Basically, what we think as choice, but what other living systems have the choice at the end. That may be, it may require some thought about finding out what is their choice. But indeed, all the living systems, I think, have choice. And it's not just human being that has the choice. Every living system has some kind of choice. So I think that is one. Other thing, as he said, was the response, for a living system, is driven from internal forces. So it may have some external influence, of course, environmental influence, but ultimately, it has a lot of internal drive, which external systems or which machines, let us say, to simplify things, will not possess. So that is the other thing, I think, what he talked about. So far as I could understand, I'm sure he could have been meaning something else, or something even more deeper. But that is, in a simple way, what I understood he was trying to say. And there are some of the things I also feel like, for example, a living system is always possessed with some kind of intuition. And with the intuition, I mean some kind of understanding of future. So, feeling that if you do this, then this might be the future of things. And if you do this, then this might be the thing. So the kind of intuition is something that is existent in the living entity. And which is more than just scientific logic. So there is the logical part, but there is this other part which may defy logic, and which is basically, I heard some discussions about Hegel, and there was another person recent times, Foucault, and I don't know if you are aware of this um, kind of philosopher of recent times, Foucault. And what he was talking about is that there are a lot of jumps that human mind would make to move from one point to other, even if there is no direct connection. So they would just jump it and reach there. Whereas these non-living systems, they have to move only in the logical way. They have no other option. And so that is the other thing. And I think this is what I, sort of felt about the video. But and there are sort of so many things I can myself, talk about how living systems are different from non-living ones. But I think let us keep the focus on the book and the video that we just saw.
Yes. In reference to in the book, we make the distinction between how we have to think about mechanical systems and biological systems. Whereas you just said everything mechanical systems is all externally put onto the system. It comes together from external forces for an external purpose, and the identity of each of the parts is the same whether or not it's inside the machine. In biological system,
Yeah,
it's some
that was
internal
another.
purpose.
Yeah, that was another interesting point he made, that if you take the mechanical or a machine system, then all the parts, whether they are inside the machine or outside, have the same function, and they are exactly the same. So, but
Mm,
if you look at the human system or a living system, then if you take those parts from the system, then they are meaningless. They have
yeah.
no function. But within the system, they have not only one, but they might have several functions. So I think, yes, that was another point that was made in this book. Yeah, please go on. Sorry, I interrupted
Oh,
you, I think.
thank you. This is very useful when you're able to share what you're thinking. And I'd actually want to go deeper into something you shared with us, which is relevant to this discussion back at the Science and Scientists Conference in 2020, when it was the first conference we had about artificial and natural intelligence. You were so basically, it's about how the ignorance of the holistic nature of an organism or a cell, also, the ignorance of that, how that affects, in a very practical way, how modern science has developed approaches in medicine. So, for instance, because the holistic approach, the holistic logic of the organism has not been embraced historically by science, now medicine has an approach where this is your example that you gave, that you may give an opioid receptor to somebody, opioid receptor stimulator for someone who has pain, such as give them fentanyl or something, and it relieves the pain, but there's opioid receptors all over the body. And because that targeted area is not is seen isolated from the context of everything else, all the other opioid receptors, then other side effects may come, such as you mentioned the respiration may be suppressed, and they may stop breathing, and even some psychoactive side effects. And these are all things that happen because when the medication was developed for the one purpose of pain relief, the holistic context was not considered. So now you have all these side effects. And this is one very clear example of how not differentiating between the logic of the machine and the teleological logic of the organism has a very practical negative effect in our society and people.
True. Yeah, I think thanks for reminding this example, and which I think sort of makes even common people understand why there are so many side effects with the allopathic drugs, and and all the, actually, as a matter of fact, any allopathic treatment approach, with by allopathic I mean modern medicine. There is a certain side effect with everything. I think a good physician recognizes this unhesitantly. So there is no perfect medicine. Even water, if you take in huge quantities, you would get hyponatremia, and you would be in serious trouble if you drink 10 liters of water every day, something like that. So there is no drug that is without all side effects. The only point of calling it a drug is when the benefits exceed the side effects. So till that point, it remains a drug. But there comes a point where the side effects may start, exceeding the benefits, and then it becomes a poison. So there is a very narrow difference between a medicine and a poison. if you look at at the big picture, the small picture, of course, it looks like some medicines are wonder drugs, but that is it. So I think exactly the same thing, that these medicines are this. See, the Cartesian theory is that human body can be broken down into individual component parts, and a diagnosis of disease is identifying which part is affected, and then treatment also involves giving something for that part and completely ignoring the whole body in the process. So if your eyes are defective, you look at what part of eye, so maybe iris is affected, and therefore you start treating the iris part, not realizing that whatever you are giving for iris may also affect the retina and may affect the cornea, and it may affect the XXXX, and not only eye, but it can even affect brain, and it might affect the heart and the central nervous system. So this kind of approach of breaking down the whole human body into machine parts is, I think, the problem of the modern medicine. And now at this point of time, I think medicine is realizing that this is not going to work, and that they are moving away from it and trying to understand the whole better than just the parts.
That's progress.
Yeah, it's a retro progress, because that was known long time back in Aristotle's time, but then we forgot it because with the I mean, there is an interesting thing that we are in a era of differentiation. So differentiation means we are getting more and more into minute things. So we first look at the cell and we say, okay, cell is the unit, and then we start saying, no, 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 cell is not the unit, but there are a lot of things inside the cell, the mitochondria, the Golgi body, the nucleus, and then we say, no, 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 nucleus is not the unit, the DNA is the unit. And then we realize that, okay, DNA is not the unit, because inside the DNA, there are different things, and then we start saying, no, molecule is the basic thing. And then from molecule we move into atom, and then from atom we move into electrons, and from electrons we move into freons. And so we keep moving into smaller, basically differentiating. And so the universe, as you know, even mechanically, after the Big Bang, it is expanding. So in a way, it is basically differentiating. And as so far as I know, according to at least Vedantic philosophy, there are phases of expansion and there are phases of contraction. So where you start going back and integrating, so there will be a phase of integration. And what we are seeing currently is a phase of differentiation. And so, from MBBS, you become a MD medicine, and from MD medicine, you become cardiologist, and from cardiologist, you become interventional cardiologist. And then from interventional cardiologist, you start saying, no, I'm actually doing only the valves, and then I'm doing this valve and things like that. So basically, the specialized people you will see are getting more and more specialized, but the more specialized you get, the more you lose contact with the whole thing. And then you are just focused at that one small thing, and you have completely lost track of what is the whole thing.
Dr. Mishra,
so that is, I think,
you brought up something very important and central to what we've been discussing this last week, and I'm very happy you brought it up, how we're seeing everything as differentiating from vast different scales. From within the macroscopic universe, we're seeing everything as differentiating, down to microscopic scales, we're seeing everything only in their differences. And now Sripad Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj addresses this very succinctly, coming from Hegel's philosophy and Immanuel Kant. They point out that our perception of nature, meaning the universe or the world or the microscopic world, our perception of nature is constituted by different thought determinations, which are more fundamental than the sensuous experience we're having. These logical thought determinations that are more fundamental because they're preceding our perception. So we have some base presumptions or assumptions in thought that then reflect to how we're perceiving our external environment. And because of the certain form of consciousness that modernity, since Descartes, has embraced, which is called in German Verstand, or the understanding, we're only seeing the differences in everything. And that's why the fields of physics, chemistry, and biology in general can't be cohesive. You have the chemist arguing with the biologist, biologists are arguing with the physicist. They agree on some things, but many things they can't be cohesively agreed on, because the way they are looking at it is with this form of consciousness called Verstand, or understanding. It's only seeing the difference in nature, only seeing this opposed to that. But then so Hegel goes on to develop what is a higher form of consciousness, which acknowledges the difference, but simultaneously is seeing that unity. So this is the dialectic approach, where it's a unity in difference. It's not either or, because then you have either abstract atomic materialism, everything is only different, period, or you have abstract monism, everything is just matter, or everything is just consciousness. Even those are both abstract. But the comprehensive idea is that both are there simultaneously, and this is what we're observing, the unity in difference. And it's very interesting, because this is the principle in the Bhagavad Vedanta called Achintya Bheda Abheda Tattva, that Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu presented 500 years ago in West Bengal. So the fact that this idea of simultaneously one and different being the fundamental nature of reality, from logic and nature and into spirit, this is the fundamental principle that spiritual science, holistic science, is actually based on. We're seeing that with the different parts of the body, it is one body, it is one person, it is a unity. It's that person differentiated into so many different constituents, but all those differentiated constituents develop as a whole, right? The embryological development is happening together, interrelated as a whole, developing as a whole, coming from another whole. So whole comes from whole and grows as a whole, not that one part is externally put on another part. That's mechanical. In the biological, it's growing as a whole, all together for the purpose of the organism. And again, that's also Vedantic perspective from Ishopanishad, Om Purnam Ada Purnamidam, Purnat Purnam Udachyate, right? And so these are showing that these more fundamental philosophical points, thought determinations, it's revealing the necessity to be aware of what our fundamental thought determinations are, because that will reflect in how we then go about our scientific study of nature. And that affects medicine, that affects technology, that affects how we conduct our own life and how we determine what is the purpose of our life, or what approach should we take to find out the purpose of life. Right? So this becomes a very spiritual thing. And it starts, though, with just being clear about what are we thinking, and how does that affect the way we perceive nature. What do you think, Dr. Mishra?
I agree. I think you are right on the target, and I never thought of it this way, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Thinking of the unity as, because it's true that the way we are taught, at least in Indian schools, is to more differentiating. And interesting thing is that if you do mathematics, and so there are 12 grades. Till 11th grade, you are doing just differentiation, and then suddenly comes the 12th grade, and they start integral calculus, and it's completely different way of thinking, and people are not prepared for it. And so they face a huge trouble in this area. And I think this is the dilemma, which currently at least the Indian society is facing, that they go to schools and they are differentiating, and then they suddenly reach the life, and they become members of the let us say society, And there they start reaching the limits of their differentiation. So they start reaching the limit, and when they reach the limit, they start seeing the paradox, and they can't understand the paradox because whatever equation they were using is now out of the boundary. So there are certain things out of the boundary of that particular equation that they have been dealing with, and so they reach the boundary of their sort of rational experience, and they start seeing the irrational things which they think of as paradox. And many of them actually, as a matter of fact, have a sort of personality disorder at this point of time, and they have a huge burnout. I mean, whatever you may call it, but they have this manifestation, which to me is just reaching the edge of their, logical sort of thinking. And that end of that edge of that logical thinking, when illogical starts, the paradox starts, and then people start running here and there. They might, Western people might visit psychiatrists, the Indian people would go to those babas, etc., and to all those astrologers and things like that, trying to figure out why things did not work the way they were supposed to work, because they were following that linear kind of thing, and that reaches they reach the edge of that linearity, and then this problem starts. So this, if the education teaches both differentiation and integration, and as you very very aptly said, and I mean, I will take this message from you, that if they start appreciating the whole and the differentiation at the same time, so I think that will make a more a wiser person more able to handle the stresses of reality. So I think we are talking of reality, and this is reality. It is number of equations. Some of them we know what is the limit and what is the exact equation, but once sort of go over that equation, and when you overcome that equation, then you come into a new equation which you don't know, and then you start thinking that it's unknown, and it is paradox and things like that. So whatever name may be called, but that is what it is. Some may call it post-traumatic stress disorder, and there are all sort of fancy names for this thing which is reaching the boundary of the logical world.
Now, it's like a process of maturity, like you were saying before. People in general, not only individuals in the Indian educational system, but individuals all over the world, they, in an immature state, myself included, I'm still in this immature state, thinking we know something, and that is going forward. Now we're going forward, we know this, and now we're progressing in that certainty. But that certainty is only based on our immediate experience. And right. When we come to the circumstance where the immediate experience turns out not to be what it appeared to be, that the immediate experience, which is what our certainty is based on, is nothing more than an appearance, and the reality behind that appearance is becoming a little more opening up to us, and we're perceiving that a little more, and we're realizing it's so far beyond our capacity to hold in our hand or in our head, and it starts to create a stressful reaction for people, and they will respond to that in so many different ways. But I think that is the point of the process of maturity, where the necessity, the scientific necessity of spiritual life becomes apparent. That's why we were always talking about spiritual science, about how God is not just the devotion, bhakti. It is not some dogmatic principle, but it's the conclusion of reason. We'll find many quotes from our acharyas that I have included in our discussion so far, where those acharyas who are sincerely realized are telling us blind faith is diseased faith. This is a matter of the development of reason and necessity. through the maturity of the soul, of the living entity, the soul, in its maturity, coming to know that it is finite. And beyond the finite is the infinite. And the finite has a necessarily dependent relationship with the infinite. And there is a scientific, systematical method to come to know what is that relationship, how to become established in that relationship, and then how to move forward in that relationship. And that is the systematic process of bhakti as ascribed to the Bhagavat tradition. It is the maturity of the Vedic science itself, right? Throughout the Vedic darshans, culminating in Vedanta, the conclusion. Veda means knowledge. The Vedic darshans are going from material to spiritual knowledge. Concludes in Vedanta, given by Bhadranarayan, Veda Vyas, they're the same person. That same individual in his manifest pastimes in this world has then given the mature fruit of the Vedanta, the Bhagavat Purana. Veda Vyas is also commenting on the Vedanta Sutra itself, talking about that systematic relationship between the finite and the infinite, and Bhagavat Purana, or the Bhagavatam, Srimad Bhagavatam. So, and this is the point that the acharyas are trying to give. Many people in the world are, taking to these kind of principles in a very sentimental and emotional and dogmatic way. But then the significance and the weight of it really loses its value when it's taken as a sentimental thing, instead of the necessity, a concrete conclusion of this progression of the living entity coming to realize, wow, contradiction is, I'm being overwhelmed by it because I'm trying to rely on myself. What to do? Okay, that's where spiritual life starts, at least that's where the necessity for spiritual life begins. And now we can inquire further into that. And that is the ultimate point of what we're trying to do here, trying to realize that and trying to practice that in a very imperfect way, but still trying to sincerely practice that. And, this is the goal, we think. This is how we feel.
Yeah, very nicely put, I think. Very nicely put. And I would definitely agree. I mean, there could be some parts I did not understand that well, but I think, because of difference in our kind of makeup, I think we might put things in a bit different way. But I think the essence I can understand completely, and I would agree with it also completely. So I think it's a good sort of exposition of what it means. So thank you so much for it.
Dr. Mishra. So this principle of how do we consider the unity in difference and how this applies in so many different ways, you're saying, you are kind of embracing the idea. We would love to, continue to discuss in whatever natural way it happens, how that unfolds,
Right, yeah. But my take-home message is that one should try to, make friends with both unity and diversity at the same time, and try to find a sort of relation between them, and not go one way or the other. So have a holistic view where both of them exist together.
All right.
That was a great idea. Yeah.
That is the idea of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, truly, and Hegel. Truly, it's there in their writings. So
yeah,
we just want to offer our respects to the Vaishnavas. Vansha kalpa triyubhyascha kripa sindhu bhyevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namah. And to our spiritual masters, Om Jnanatimirem Hasya Jananjana Salakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. And our sincere, respectful obeisances to Dr. Sundeep Mishra. Thank you.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Namaste. Dhanavad Pranam. This is
Namaste.
Yes. I'm here with Dr. Brian Ford, a cell biologist from England. And Professor Ford has many times participated in our science and scientist conferences, and also on the Sadhu Sangha Google group. And has given many valuable contributions, and we're happy to be with him here today to discuss some points from the video of the first chapter of Idols of the Mind versus True Reality by Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj. The name of the chapter is The Logic of Life. And this is very nice to be able to talk with Professor Ford about this, because he has spent an entire career looking at cells and has made some very nice observations about how cells behave and what kind of activities they engage in. And we look forward to hearing his perspective on the logic of life from what he has firsthand observed and experienced. So Professor Ford, can I ask you, what were some of the impressions that you had from watching that video?
Oh, well, that's interesting. My main impression was that two of the main themes were firstly the lack of external agency for life, and also that one gains most interest by studying living cells under the microscope, mechanisms such as the way in which they heal. But what did catch my attention, and will catch the attention of others, is of course that these are my fields of research in which I've been involved for about 50 years. And yet the video didn't in any way refer to that. The healing of cells and the connotation of intelligence that is inherent in that process is of course something on which I've published extensively. Indeed, I will append for everyone to see a bibliography of papers in which I have been publishing this and which are well known around the world. And I was quite surprised to see that an institute which is striving to make for itself a reputation of inquiry and openness would seek to discuss at such length research of my own without apportioning credit where it is due. Don't get me wrong, my work is well accepted and I'm not objecting personally, but I'm a little nonplussed to think that an institute would be so publicly avowing views which all of those in the field know belong to my research. So I would encourage you, when future videos are done, to make sure that proper credit is given where necessary, as it reflects a lack of dignity on an up-and-coming institute.
I see. Well, all of the things mentioned in the video were from an essay Dr. Puri wrote in 2008, and much of it was taken from research that he has done, and nothing specifically was from any of your essays, although from our interactions with you since then, we've become aware that you're working on the same thing.
Yes,
so
the
nice
healing of cells. Yes, the healing of cells is an example, and nobody in the world has published on the healing of cells in the way in which I have. And indeed, my publications have been going on for close to 50 years. So it would show scholarship and integrity were those facts to be mentioned in future. However, don't let that deter you. If you had things to ask, please ask, and I'll be happy to answer.
Sure. So first, going forward, are there any resources online, like freely accessible libraries of videos where we can find these things so that we can present them to others?
That's a very good question. And there are two answers. The easy answer is yes, there are. But the second answer, the practical answer, is that in a busy life, I have never really had time to coordinate them and correlate them as I should. I do give public lectures on the wonders that one sees down the microscope and how this relates to our understanding of cellular intelligence. And prompted by your question, I will endeavor over the next month or so to try and put some of these together and let you have links to them, because I'm sure people would find some of those of interest. There are lectures going back a decade or two in which many of these phenomena were broached. Most of them at Cambridge, one at Oxford, and some also in London and the United States. And many of these, I'm regularly asked by people, can we sit and watch these things? And they do need to be ordered so that they are more easily accessible. And I must accept full responsibility for not having been more devoted to that. The only excuse I can make is that, I'm 84, and one is inevitably aware of the fact that one doesn't have immortality, no matter how much one would rather like to have a little bit of it. And I do want to get things in print and organized. Recently, for example, I've been publishing about one article per week in the scientific publications, which is quite a high rate of output, but one does want to make sure that one's ideas are there for people to access in future. However, you're quite right to raise the question. And I will endeavor to make sure that some of these are put into a more coherent and ordered and accessible form, so that students who might be interested will find them easier to find in future than they were in the past.
We look forward to that for sure. And we appreciate your effort in that regard. I'll move forward to some questions then I have, if that's okay.
Of course, please.
So you mentioned recognizing in the video our mention of the lack of external necessity prompting the activities of organisms and cells.
Yeah.
So from your work, what can you say about the activities of cells that would lead you to describe it as cognitive behavior? And
Well,
why does it normally get thrown under the mechanistic metaphor?
now you've always been a very good questioner, and those are excellent questions. And there are many layers to the answers. In terms of cells and cognition, we pride ourselves on our senses of touch and of taste and of hearing and of sight. But if I were to take you to the leaf of a little weed growing in the garden, and to look at the stomata, and to look at one single stomatal plant cell, well, that cell will respond to chemical change. Therefore, it has olfactory sense. It will respond to luminescence and to receive light. Therefore, it has, in a primitive sense, some sort of awareness of sight. It will respond to vibration. So you could say that it has a sense of hearing. It responds to touch. So it has a tactile sense as well. So the important point to realize is that cells share with us their own simple cellular versions of the senses on which we pride ourselves, and which we rather hubristically imagine our senses specifically confined to higher organisms, most importantly to humans. But no, all cells have a level of cognition, and it's very important that we recognize that. There are fundamental differences between my understanding of life and what your video says. For example, the video made the point that if you were to remove a part from a whole, then the part will not function and the whole will not function. But in life, that's not true. You could, for example, remove, were you diligent enough and accurate enough, you could remove the chloroplasts from, let us say, a cell of Hydra, and each of them will act as chlorella, as an independent alga, and carry on living life as though nothing in the world has happened. The amoeba, meanwhile, will carry on functioning as though nothing ever has happened. They benefit from each other's presence, but they're not actually confined to it. And it is very important to realize that within a cell lie other cells. Mitochondria, for example, are regularly portrayed as though they're little round structured sausages in which energy is released. And so, no. They are living organisms with a sense of cognizance of their own. Mitochondria move around within cells. Mitochondria change their position, change their size, change their orientation. They were, of course, originally acquired by higher cells by acquisition when they were presumably some sort of saprophytic invader. They were once bacteria, and although we forget the fact conveniently, mitochondria contain their own genetic material. They contain their own DNA. In many ways, mitochondria are almost independent microbes living within the cell. But cells don't only require nothing from outside by way of agency of control or regulation, but of course a cell also makes itself. And that is the one point missing from your admirable, and I may say very well produced video. I did like all the cutaways and the little illustrative examples that you put together. They were very professionally done. But a cell makes itself. That's the point. I keep seeing people turning up, and indeed I've discussed this at one of your conferences, I keep seeing people turning up with humanoid robots and insisting that these robots are almost alive. Indeed, the Jimmy Fallon television show, I remember showing this at one of your conferences a couple of years ago, had a robot called, I think, Sophia. And Jimmy Fallon said to Mr. Hanson, who invented Sophia, she's basically alive, isn't she? And Hanson, yeah. He said, yeah, she's basically alive. No, she's a doll. She's a doll just like the toys we buy our kids for Christmas. The dolls we buy for our kids at Christmas may open and shut their eyes and say a few words, or if they're little doggies, they will wag their tails and sit down and stand up, sometimes in response to voice commands. But they're dolls, and Sophia and all the other robots are just dolls. When people create a humanoid head and it blinks and moves its eyes, people say, wow, this is like a human. No, it isn't. A human makes a human. A human fuels a human. A human powers a human, all without external agencies, not just a question of control or autonomy. Your video mentioned, for example, how bodies that show autonomy are essentially living and other bodies aren't. No, you can create autonomous robots. You can create all sorts of systems that will motivate themselves in response to what they detect from their environment, irrespective of what humans are doing. They can motivate themselves into action in response to environmental cues. They do not require human intervention to control them. They are, to all intents and purposes, autonomous. So the autonomy argument doesn't just apply if you're trying to distinguish life from non-life. The difference between life and non-life is that the living organism makes itself. That is the difference. A robot is made in a factory. An artificial kidney, let's say, look, I have an artificial, no, that's not an artificial kidney. The machine you've got conducts dialysis, but the fluid that you put into the machine and the way the fluid is made is produced in a factory full of technical staff. That's also part of the kidney. You cannot make an artificial kidney. You cannot make an artificial person. If you did create a successful artificial person, well, you'd have to create two of them so they could reproduce, but they would then produce more of themselves. It is not the autonomy of behavior that matters with living things, but the fact that a living thing knows how to fuel itself and make more of itself. That's the difference between the ant and the marble, not the shape, the consistency, or the external agencies that mediate its behavior, but the fact that a person made the marble, whereas an ant made the ant.
Now, what about this ability to act spontaneously? That was really the heart of that initial part of the presentation, was the ant can spontaneously do what it wants based on its own reasons. That's something that even an autonomous robot can't do. It will react to the environment based on whatever algorithms have programmed, whatever options it has available, but still it has no capacity to act spontaneously.
Well,
Isn't that true?
that depends. It depends on what you mean by spontaneously. There are plenty of autonomous robots which are now programmed with algorithms written by youngsters. They're arbitrary. They are often incorrect. They are almost always biased. But there are plenty. Space modules are a great example, which can be sent into the far reaches of space and will trigger themselves into action. And there are lots of robotic systems that will learn from the errors that they have committed and will use that learning to mediate their future behavior. And once you set them up, a person could go away and they would meet all sorts of contingencies. So in an era of AI, which, as I think you know, is not a term I approve of, but in a world where artificial intelligence is dominating our behavior, it's very, very difficult to use autonomous, regressive or progressive activity as an arbiter of living or non-living. The reason I don't like artificial intelligence is because, of course, artificial intelligence simply searches whatever digitally available information there is. There's been a lot of talk recently, for example, of how an AI system can pass exams better than a student. Well, of course an AI system can. The AI system, unlike the hapless student, has every textbook and paper in the world on that subject available to it. The student has to sit there on their own. If the student said, I want to sit this exam in the library and pull off the shelves any book I wish to consult to give me the answer, then you or I could pass any exam in any subject because information is available to us. But it isn't artificial intelligence. It is, as I've so often said, digitized automation. That is what we're in the era of. We are in the era of digitized automation. Calling it artificial intelligence dignifies it in the minds of its proponents so that people will be overcome with a sense of awe and wonder and justify the extortionate amount of expense and time that's going into discussing it. But it's not. It is digitized automation. That's all it is. And as soon as I say that, I will make you realize that the limits of its activity are constrained by the limits of what has been digitized. And most things are not amenable to digitization. You cannot digitize how the cells in your body have healed themselves when you've been cut. You cannot digitize why you might find yourself falling in love with someone. You could not digitize why you've decided to adopt the faith that you do and acquire the behavioral habits in your life that you now have. Over the years, much of human knowledge has been digitized, and that is available to any automatic system, any digitally automated system that wishes to access it. But most things in life cannot be digitized. And if they could be digitized one day, they certainly haven't been. The minutest part, the almost unimaginably minutest fraction of what happens in life has ever been digitized. And I don't think most of it ever is amenable to digitization anyway. Digitization is limited to what's in print and what has been digitized. And that is a minutest fraction of what happens in the world.
I would agree with a lot of what you said. I'd like to pivot though, just to try to bring the focus back to now life. So mentioning how the main principle that governs what is different from life versus non-life is its ability to reproduce itself. Right? Cells come from cells. Cellula is cellular. Rudolf Virchow very poignantly said that, right? Omni vivo ex vivum. Louis Pasteur very nicely said that life comes from life, cells comes from cells. That's how it is. Also in Vedic wisdom, we find the same thing. Om Purnam Adap Purnamidam. From the whole comes the whole, and the original whole does not diminish from a new whole coming from it. So this is perennial wisdom about what governs life. But
it's perennial wisdom that I keep seeing people ignore. And that is extraordinary. I'm always hearing people comparing robots to humans in terms of what they can do. And as you know, I have said this in the past. Indeed, I published an article in 1967 that was looking at the possibility of the threats of artificial intelligence. And I said then, at that time, remember, the atom bomb was the big threat and who was going to press the button. And I said in that article, I think it was in 1967, possibly 66, that you can program a computer any way you want, but if it hasn't got a thumb, it can't press the button. And I said in the same article that people marvel at computers because computers can do things that no human can do, but so can a drawing pin, so can a knife, so can a pair of scissors. The inimitability of human activity is no arbiter of whether anything is intelligent or not. Computers are absolutely fabulous. I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation without them, but it is bizarre to imagine that they're somehow going to supplant us. I mean, people have looked at Chat GPT and said how wonderful it shows intelligence. No, it doesn't. I published an article some years ago which critiqued the law of Alan Turing. Turing once said, if you can have a conversation with another entity and you cannot distinguish whether that is a human or not, then that is artificial intelligence. Then you've got this beginning of what you call the singularity, where the mechanical and the living come together. And I said in my article, no, that's not true. All you have to do is to say to this other entity, did you have breakfast this morning or were you switched on? And that immediately tells you whether it was a person or not. The way in which you would show whether something is alive or not would be to damage it and see if it heals itself. If it does, it's living. If it doesn't, it's not.
Now, regarding the differences, the relationship between cells and organisms themselves. So we have two forms of life that are interconnected to each other, but different subdisciplines of biology look at their relationship from different perspectives. This conversation was briefly started between yourself and Sripad Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj maybe last year, I think, and it was at the very end of the conference, so it didn't go very far, but I'd like to just try to see if we can bring it further a little bit. So you're a cell biologist, and from your perspective, the cells make the organism, so to speak. And from the perspective of those who are more engaged with the organismic perspective, it seems the reverse, that the organism makes the cells, that the organisms reproduce, and then through the process of the embryological development, the cells are reproducing and tissues are forming, etc. So I'm not looking to come to any conclusion about this, but just to take that conversation a bit farther, because I think it's important. Yep. What are your thoughts about the organism kind of leading the development, since it's at the organismic level that the reproduction happens, and then all the cellular activity is happening to form the mature organism?
That's another of your very good questions. The point is that medicine, anatomy, and most philosophers tend to think of the human body as an organism containing organs. You have one of everything down the middle, nose, umbilicus, genitals, and two of everything down the side, arms, legs, ears, and eyes. And then it's a bunch of organs wrapped up in a bundle of skin and bones. That's wrong. The organism is a community of semi-autonomous cells which know what to do and how to play their part. And in fact, I discussed this in a publication in 1976, where I said my view of it was this: cells, as they evolved, became increasingly specialized. And the most advanced cells, like some of the euglenoides, some of the advanced cells not only have enormous capacity for movement and for integrating themselves in the environment, for sensing, for responding, but they even have organelles, including an eye spot with a little curved retina and a tiny little lens. I mean, these things are as packed full of organelles as you can imagine. There is a ciliated organism, which you can just see with the naked eye, called epididymium, which lives in the rumen of cattle. And it is most extraordinary complicated little thing with its own feeding and excretory mechanisms, its own regulatory systems, its own systems of motility and contact and interactivity. It's an amazing creature. And my view has always been that multicellularity came about when cells, instead of dividing and separating, realized it might make more sense to divide and stick together, and for one cell to specialize in one particular function, whilst other cells specialize in doing something else. So that in a multicellular organism, you have the same cells you started off with, except rather than all of them being able to sense and see and respond and detect, you have some cells in the retina which become specialized only for doing the seeing. And because they're specialized, can do it much better. You have other cells, like those of the bactillium corpuscle in the skin, which specialize only in tactility and therefore become organs of sense. You have other cells, because these cells are motile and regularly contract and expand as they move, which specialize only in contraction and become muscle cells, and therefore they control and regulate and produce movement in the adult organism. So for me, a multicellular creature like you, is a community of cells in which they divvied out between themselves the various labors that are necessary to make you into whom you are. So instead of wasting time for each cell trying to do everything, one cell just does what it's good at and leaves other cells elsewhere to do what they wish. So of the dichotomous argument that you posited just now, it's quite clear that it's the first explanation that is right and not the second. This is not an organism divided up into cells, as it were, for convenience or for structural integrity or for maintenance or something of the sort. It is a bunch of cells which have recognized the use of sticking together, because apart from anything else, you can escape from a watery environment. And some cells specialize in becoming a waterproof integument, which we call the skin. And they use their senses to go and find food and drink and a mate. And those are all the things that our senses are there for. And as a result, you can have a community of cells that is able to get out of the water and walk around the world and build a civilization for itself. Whereas if you don't do that, you've got to do it all within one cell. And as these complicated and very beautiful organisms have shown, there is a strict limit to that. And there's a concomitant to what I'm saying. And that is that the ability of a multicellular organism is defined entirely by the abilities inherent of its component cells. People say to me, well, what about a hot air balloon or the Great Wall of China? Well, if I'm right, then single cells must be able to do those versions. Single cells must be able to do their own versions of those things. And indeed, that turns out to be true. If you look at the pollen pine grains from a conifer, and you will see that those pine grains have, as it were, water wings, gas-inflated balloons on either side, which allow them to float in huge numbers and for vast distances in order to pollinate a female plant. So far as the Great Wall of China is concerned, well, no, organisms aren't going to build the Great Wall of China, but microscopic organisms have built the Great Barrier Reef, which is said to be visible from space, although, as a matter of interest, the Great Wall of China is not visible from space. And of course, if it comes to putting together bricks to make a wall, well, the shell-building amoebae that I have presented at your meetings show how they can pick up grains of sand and cement them together to make a beautiful little vase-shaped house for themselves. Well, if amoebae can build a home for themselves, so can the humans that amoebae eventually go into. And if you want to see an amoeba, prick yourself. Look at a living blood smear under the microscope. Dilute it with saline. And there you will see phagocytes, neutrophils, the polymorphonuclear granulocyte, as it is officially called. You watch one of those and you will see why it's an amoeba. It moves around, it senses itself, it finds a pathogen, it rounds on the pathogen, consumes the pathogen, eats it, and gets rid of it. That's how you stay healthy. You've just been inhaling staphylococci as we talk. And the white cells in your throat have been alerted, have identified them, have chased them, eliminated them. And that's why you're not going to have a sore throat tomorrow morning. But that's an amoeba. You look at that single cell and you think to yourself, that cell is one of my cells. That cell is an amoeba that instead of living in a pond is cooperating with all the other cells to create a human. That amoeba is not controlled by my brain. Its actions are not mediated by my nervous system. It is not influenced by any hormones circulating in my blood. That's an amoeba making its own decisions, knowing what it has to do, and in doing so, keeping the rest of the cell community safe. Yes, bodies are communities of cells. They are not divided up into cells purely for administrative convenience.
I know we're reaching the end of the half an hour we agreed to, but would you be okay with me raising one challenge to that?
Oh, you raise a challenge. Of course you can. We know each other well enough for that.
So the multicellular organism being a collection, a community of specialized cells, specialized to various degrees. Well, so then I am experiencing that. If that's the case, that is, you're saying that is me, but I have a singular identity. So if I am just a community of specialized cells, that seems to contradict my singular identity. I say I'm talking about a unity, a singular myself. And I have the experience of being a cohesive unity. There's many different aspects of myself, no doubt, but it's a unity in difference because I am myself, I am a unity. So what you explained doesn't seem to account for that unity of the organism that has a singular identity.
Well, two things. Firstly, the conundrum which you very sensibly raised is summed up in just one word that crept into the beginning of your question. And that word was just. You said, how am I just a community of self? No, there's no just about it. You are an amazing, astonishing, incredible, unfathomably unmeasurable community of self. It's not just self. That's somebody saying, I've been to India, I just went for a week. No, you go for a week in India and you'll be bombarded with so many impulses and findings and emotions and experiences. There's no just about it. Coming to India for a week is an incredible experience. And looking at yourselves is an amazing, astonishing, unimaginable revelation. It's not just. But the second thing is that the reason you have this personality is because of the ineffable, unfathomable uniqueness of complexity within that cellular community. And when the coordination between those cells breaks down, that is when you die. And here is a thought for everybody. There is always life after death. When you die, when the physician is holding your pulse and the pulse stops and you exhale and there is no more movement, that physician will turn to the people gathered round the bed, hopefully sobbing with great distress, and will say to them, that's the moment of death. But think of it my way. Every cell in that body is still as alive now as it was before death was pronounced. The cells have not all died. The cells of the cornea, for example, the endothelial cells that line the inside of the cornea and maintain its structural integrity and its water content, they can live for a fortnight after death. When you die, all that is lost is the coordination between that cell community. But the cells are all still alive. Not one cell has died, even though you have. And so when you speak of how can I, as a person, be manifested through the actions of a community of single, autonomous, but individual cells, well, there's the answer. That's why everybody is unique. Because you can clone people. We do it all the time. They're called identical twins. And yet they're not identical. They never can be identical. They look the same, but in no way are they identical. They have different personalities, different ways of behaving, different sensitivities, different sensibilities. And they result from the uniqueness of the incredible complexity of that cellular community. At the moment that you die, and your soul, if you wish, floats to heaven, what's lost at that moment is the continuity between the cells. But the cells themselves are all still as alive after death as they were when you were alive. So in the chicken and egg sense, the cells are what matter. The person doesn't.
We always very much appreciate your perspective. You're very, very detail oriented and very thoughtful about everything you present. And it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Professor Ford. Hopefully you also, hopefully we're able to communicate some ideas also that present or inspire things that haven't been considered before, although we're very imperfect, and anything I'm saying is just a very improper version of what I've heard from people who know much more than me and are much more, have much more to say. But I'm just trying to present what I can.
I'm always working in the future. I'm a couple of decades ahead of you always, but I have to say that it's always a pleasure to interact with you. You are a sharp young man with a good mind, and also widely read, and all of those are appreciated. So within reason, if ever I can help, I will. But just remember, when these revolutionary ideas are promulgated, just remember where they began. I think that's important, don't you?
I would have to agree, of course.
Goodbye now.
Yes, we just close, give our honor to the devotees and to the sincere seekers. Vanchakalpa Tribhascha Kripa Sindhu Bhyavicha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namah, and our teachers, Mama Janata Miran Hasya, Janan Janasalakaya, Chak Shorn Militamina, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Thank you.